Deep beneath the Amazon rainforest, where sunlight barely penetrates the emerald canopy, lies evidence of a civilization so advanced it challenges everything we thought we knew about the ancient Americas. For centuries, explorers dismissed the Amazon as an untamed wilderness, too hostile for complex societies to flourish. Yet satellite technology and ground-penetrating radar have begun revealing geometric patterns hidden beneath the jungle floor. Massive earthwork stretching for kilometers, stone foundations of cities that once housed millions, agricultural systems more sophisticated than anything we use today. The Amazon, it turns out, was not an empty green hell, but the cradle of one of humanity's most remarkable civilizations. The story begins in 1925 with a British explorer whose name would become synonymous with mystery and obsession. Percy Harrison Fawcett was no ordinary adventurer. A seasoned cartographer for the Royal Geographical Society, he had spent decades mapping the uncharted regions of South America. His surveys had taken him through territories where no European foot had trod, where indigenous peoples spoke of ruins older than memory and cities swallowed by the forest. But it was a manuscript in the National Library of Rio de Janeiro that would consume the final years of his life. Document 512, as historians now call it, was a report written in 1753 by a Portuguese bandeirante, a colonial fortune hunter who claimed to have discovered the ruins of an ancient city deep in the Mato Grosso. The account described stone buildings with hieroglyphic inscriptions, broad plazas paved with blocks of fitted stone, and statues carved with faces unlike any known indigenous art. The bandeirante wrote of finding gold artifacts and precious stones scattered among collapsed temples, evidence of a wealth and sophistication that seemed impossible in the heart of the jungle. Most scholars dismiss the document as fantasy, the fevered imagination of a gold-crazed prospector. But Fawcett saw patterns that others missed. The geographical descriptions matched regions he had explored. The architectural details resembled ruins he had encountered in Bolivia and Peru. Most compelling of all, the manuscript described a network of ancient roads connecting multiple cities, a vast urban complex hidden beneath the Amazon canopy. Fawcett called this lost civilization the City of Z. To him, it represented proof that the Amazon had once supported a sophisticated culture capable of monumental architecture and complex social organization. He spent years planning his expedition, studying indigenous languages, gathering supplies, and recruiting companions brave enough to follow him into the unknown. In 1925, accompanied by his eldest son Jack and Jack's friend Raleigh Rimmel, Fawcett disappeared into the Brazilian wilderness. They were never seen again. For decades, the fate of the Fawcett expedition remained one of exploration's greatest mysteries. Rescue missions found no trace of the men. Indigenous peoples offered conflicting stories of their disappearance. Some claimed they had been killed by hostile tribes. Others insisted they had found their lost city and chosen to remain there. The Amazon had swallowed them as completely as it had swallowed the civilization they sought. Yet Fawcett's obsession was not entirely misguided. Archaeological evidence has since confirmed that the Amazon basin once supported dense populations and complex societies. What modern science has revealed exceeds even Fawcett's wildest theories. The pre-Columbian Amazon was not a pristine wilderness, but a managed landscape shaped by millions of indigenous inhabitants over thousands of years. The breakthrough came not from machetes and shovels, but from space. In the 1970s, satellite imagery began revealing strange geometric patterns across the Amazon basin, perfectly straight lines cutting through the forest, circular and square earthworks covering areas larger than entire cities. These formations, invisible from ground level, could only be detected from above, hidden beneath the canopy that had protected them for centuries. Initially, archaeologists struggled to interpret these images. The patterns were too regular to be natural, too vast to be the work of small tribal societies. Some suggested they were roads or ceremonial pathways. Others proposed they were defensive structures built to protect settlements from invaders. But as more satellites mapped the region and technology improved, a startling picture emerged. The geometric patterns were not isolated features, but components of an integrated system spanning thousands of square kilometers. The first major excavation of these sites began in the 1980s in the Brazilian state of Acre. When researchers cleared sections of forest to examine the earthworks beneath, they uncovered evidence of sophisticated engineering. The geometric patterns were not simple earth mounds, but complex structures with multiple levels, drainage systems, and carefully planned layouts. Radiocarbon dating of organic material found within the earthworks revealed ages ranging from 2,000 to 700 years, proving that these were not recent constructions, but the remnants of ancient civilizations. What archaeologists found challenged fundamental assumptions about Amazonian prehistory. The earthworks, known locally as geoglyphs, covered an area roughly the size of Great Britain. They included circular enclosures up to 300 meters in diameter, square compounds with sides measuring several kilometers, and linear features stretching for dozens of kilometers through the forest. The scale was monumental, requiring coordinated labor forces and sophisticated planning. These were not the works of scattered hunter-gatherer bands, but of organized societies with the resources and knowledge to reshape entire landscapes. Even more remarkable was the discovery that these earthworks were not built in cleared forest, but in areas that had been carefully managed for centuries. Soil analysis revealed that the ancient inhabitants had created what scientists now call anthropogenic soils, or terra preta. These dark, fertile soils were artificially enriched with charcoal, pottery fragments, and organic matter, creating agricultural zones far more productive than the naturally poor soils of the Amazon basin. The indigenous peoples had not simply adapted to their environment, they had transformed it. The implications were staggering. If the earthworks of Acre represented the work of complex societies, what lay hidden beneath the vast expanses of Amazon rainforest that remained unexplored? Scientists began to realize that what they had long assumed was pristine wilderness might actually be a recovering landscape, a forest that had regrown over the ruins of a lost civilization. This realization gained support from an unexpected source: the accounts of early European explorers who had actually witnessed Amazonian cities before disease and conquest destroyed them. When Spanish conquistador Francisco de Orellana became the first European to navigate the length of the Amazon River in 1542, his chronicler Gaspar de Carvajal described settlements that stretched for kilometers along the riverbanks. He wrote of cities with populations in the tens of thousands, ruled by powerful chiefs who commanded vast territories. The Spanish reported seeing roads, bridges, and ceremonial centers of impressive scale and sophistication. For centuries, historians dismissed these accounts as exaggerations designed to impress European sponsors. The Amazon they knew was sparsely populated, its indigenous peoples living in small villages with simple technologies. But archaeologists now recognize that the Spanish may have witnessed the final flowering of Amazonian civilization before epidemic diseases brought by Europeans decimated the indigenous population. Within a generation of first contact, diseases like smallpox, measles, and typhus had killed up to 90% of the native peoples. The cities Orellana described were abandoned, their populations dead or fled, leaving only ruins that the jungle quickly reclaimed. This demographic catastrophe explains why later European explorers found an apparently empty wilderness where their predecessors had encountered thriving cities. The forest seemed so pristine and untouched was actually recovering from the greatest human tragedy in the Amazon's history. What appeared to be virgin rainforest was in many cases secondary growth, trees and vegetation reclaiming lands that had been cultivated for millennia. Modern technology has begun to peer through that green veil, revealing the true extent of pre-Columbian Amazonian civilization. Light detection and ranging technology, known as LIDAR, uses laser pulses to create detailed three-dimensional maps of terrain beneath forest canopy. When archaeologists began applying LIDAR to the Amazon, the results revolutionized their understanding of the region's past. Geometric patterns invisible from ground level emerged with startling clarity. The technology revealed not just isolated earthworks, but entire urban networks connected by raised causeways and surrounded by agricultural zones. In Bolivia's Llanos de Mojos region, LIDAR surveys have mapped over 26,000 square kilometers of ancient landscape modification. The area contains thousands of earthen mounds, many arranged in precise geometric patterns. Some mounds rise 15 meters above the surrounding floodplain and cover areas equivalent to several city blocks. Between the mounds, archaeologists have identified canals, raised fields, and causeways forming an integrated water management system that allowed intensive agriculture in a seasonally flooded landscape. Similar discoveries have emerged across the Amazon basin. In Brazil's Upper Xingu region, satellite imagery and ground surveys have revealed the remains of at least 19 settlements connected by a network of roads. The largest of these settlements covered over 50 hectares and supported an estimated population of 2,500 people. But this was not an isolated urban center. The entire region appears to have been densely settled, with smaller villages clustered around the major towns and connected by a web of paths and waterways. The scale of these discoveries has forced archaeologists to reconsider their estimates of pre-Columbian Amazonian population. Where once they suggested that the basin supported perhaps 1 million indigenous inhabitants, current research indicates that the number may have been closer to 10 or even 20 million people. The Amazon was not a sparsely populated frontier, but one of the most densely settled regions in the pre-Columbian Americas. These millions of people did not live as simple hunter-gatherers, scratching a subsistence living from the forest. They were sophisticated societies with complex social hierarchies, specialized crafts, and monumental architecture. They created artificial landscapes of remarkable ingenuity, transforming flood-prone lowlands into productive agricultural zones and building cities that rivaled contemporary settlements in other parts of the world. The evidence of this sophistication extends beyond earthworks and population estimates to the artifacts that ancient Amazonians left behind. Ceramic traditions in the region date back at least 8,000 years, making them among the oldest in the Americas. The pottery shows remarkable artistic achievement with complex polychrome designs and sophisticated firing techniques. Some ceramic vessels are so large they could only have been made by specialists using advanced kilns, indicating craft specialization and trade networks spanning vast distances. Stone tools found at Amazonian archaeological sites reveal similar complexity. While the region lacks easily accessible stone deposits, ancient inhabitants imported raw materials from sources hundreds of kilometers away. They created elaborate grinding stones for processing plant foods, ceremonial axes with intricate carvings, and ornamental objects of remarkable beauty. The effort required to obtain these materials and transform them into finished goods speaks to societies with surplus labor and long-distance exchange networks. Perhaps most remarkable of all was their mastery of the forest itself. Modern botanists studying the composition of Amazonian rainforest have discovered that what appears to be wild jungle is actually a carefully curated ecosystem. Certain tree species occur in unnaturally high concentrations near archaeological sites. Brazil nut groves, palm stands, and fruit trees cluster around ancient settlements in patterns that could only result from deliberate cultivation. The indigenous peoples had not simply lived within the forest, they had redesigned it to serve their needs. This forest management extended to the creation of what scientists now call forest islands. These are patches of exceptionally fertile soil surrounded by areas of typical Amazonian terrain. Archaeological investigation reveals that these islands mark the locations of ancient villages and towns. Over centuries of habitation, the accumulation of organic waste, Charcoal from controlled burns and pottery fragments created pockets of enriched earth that continue to support distinctive plant communities today. The most striking example of this landscape engineering appears in the Beni region of Bolivia, where aerial photography has revealed thousands of raised mounds scattered across the seasonally flooded savannas. These artificial hills, some covering areas equivalent to several football fields, were constructed to provide dry living spaces during the annual floods. But they served multiple purposes beyond mere shelter. Each mound was surrounded by canals and ditches that channeled floodwaters into managed wetlands perfect for cultivating fish and waterfowl. Recent excavations of these mounds have uncovered evidence of permanent settlements with substantial architecture. Stone foundations support what were once large communal buildings. Elaborate drainage systems kept living areas dry even during the most severe floods. Centers adapted to the rhythms of fluviuses that could sustain food rows but year. Storage facilities preserving communities through lean seasons. These when waters round urban were not temporary camps abandoned and drought. The sophistication of Amazonian water management becomes even more apparent when viewed through the lens of agricultural engineering. In regions where seasonal flooding made conventional farming impossible, ancient inhabitants created vast networks of raised fields separated by canals. These systems, covering thousands of square kilometers, transformed wetlands into productive farmland capable of supporting dense populations. The raised fields were not simple mounds of dirt, but carefully engineered growing platforms. Their height was calibrated to keep crops above flood levels while maintaining access to groundwater during dry seasons. The canals between fields served multiple functions, providing fish habitat, transportation routes, and sources of fertile muck that could be periodically spread on the growing surfaces to maintain soil fertility. Archaeological investigation of these agricultural systems has revealed a level of planning and coordination that challenges assumptions about indigenous capabilities. The fields were laid out in precise geometric patterns optimized for water flow and crop rotation. Causeways connected different sections of the network, allowing farmers to move between fields even during floods. Settlements were strategically placed at junctions in the canal system, positioned to control water flow and trade routes. Carbon dating of organic material from the raised fields indicates that some systems were in continuous use for over 1,000 years. This represents an extraordinary achievement in sustainable agriculture, maintaining soil fertility and crop yields over periods that saw the rise and fall of entire civilizations in other parts of the world. The techniques developed by Amazonian farmers were so effective that modern agricultural scientists are studying them for insights into sustainable farming practices. But the ancient Amazonians were not content with transforming wetlands alone. In upland areas where flooding was not a concern, they developed different strategies for intensive agriculture. Terra preta, the anthropogenic black soil found throughout the region, represents perhaps their greatest achievement in soil science. These artificially enriched soils are so fertile that they continue to support exceptional crop yields centuries after their creation. The process of creating terra preta required sophisticated understanding of soil chemistry and plant nutrition. Ancient farmers mixed charcoal, pottery fragments, human waste, and organic matter in precise proportions to create growing medium far superior to the naturally acidic soils of the Amazon basin. The charcoal provided stable carbon that improved soil structure and water retention. Pottery fragments supplied essential minerals like phosphorus and calcium. Organic waste contributed nitrogen and other nutrients essential for plant growth. The scale of terra preta creation suggests coordinated efforts involving entire communities over many generations. Some patches of enriched soil cover hundreds of hectares, representing the accumulated work of thousands of people over centuries. The soil improvements were not random experiments, but systematic modifications based on detailed knowledge of plant nutrition and soil management. This agricultural sophistication supported population densities that modern agronomists would consider impossible without industrial fertilizers and mechanized equipment. Archaeological surveys in the central Amazon have identified sites where ancient settlements were spaced only a few kilometers apart, creating essentially continuous urban landscapes along major rivers. The Tapajós River alone may have supported over 500,000 inhabitants, organized into chiefdoms that controlled territories stretching for hundreds of kilometers. These chiefdoms were not isolated political entities, but components of larger networks that facilitated trade and cultural exchange across vast distances. Artifacts found at Amazonian archaeological sites include materials from the Andes, the Caribbean, and even North America. Shell ornaments from Pacific beaches, copper tools from Andean mines, and ceramic styles from distant regions all appear in Amazonian settlements, evidence of trade relationships spanning the entire South American continent. The exchange networks extended beyond material goods to include knowledge and technology. Agricultural techniques developed in one region spread rapidly to others. Architectural styles showed influences from multiple cultural traditions. Even languages reveal evidence of long-distance contact, with vocabulary related to trade and technology shared among groups, separated by thousands of kilometers. This interconnected world reached its peak between 1000 and 1500 CE, when Amazonian societies achieved levels of complexity rivaling contemporary civilizations in Europe and Asia. But unlike those old world societies, Amazonian civilization developed in apparent isolation from external influences. They created their own writing systems, developed unique architectural traditions, and invented agricultural techniques perfectly adapted to tropical conditions. The written records of this civilization remain largely undeciphered, preserved in petroglyphs carved into rock faces throughout the Amazon basin. These symbols appear at sites separated by vast distances, suggesting a shared system of communication that linked different regions and cultures. Some petroglyphs clearly represent astronomical observations, tracking the movements of sun, moon, and stars with remarkable precision. Others may record historical events, genealogies, or religious beliefs. The astronomical knowledge encoded in these rock carvings demonstrates sophisticated understanding of celestial mechanics. Many petroglyph sites are positioned to mark important solar and lunar events, functioning as massive stone calendars that tracked seasonal changes crucial for agricultural planning. The precision of these alignments required generations of careful observation and mathematical calculation. Similar astronomical sophistication appears in the orientation of major earthworks and settlements. Many geometric enclosures align with cardinal directions or important stellar events. The largest earthworks often incorporate multiple astronomical alignments, suggesting they served as observatories as well as ceremonial centers. This integration of astronomy and architecture created landscapes that functioned as three-dimensional calendars, encoding temporal knowledge in permanent form. The religious beliefs of Amazonian civilizations remain largely mysterious, but archaeological evidence suggests complex ceremonial practices involving elaborate rituals and monumental constructions. The largest earthworks clearly serve ceremonial rather than residential functions, with features designed for public gatherings and ritual performances. Artifact deposits at these sites include elaborate ceremonial objects, evidence of feasting, and remains of sacrificial offerings. These ceremonial complexes were not isolated temples, but centers of regional power that coordinated religious and political authority across vast territories. The effort required to construct them reveals societies capable of mobilizing thousands of workers for decades-long projects. Labor specialization allowed some individuals to focus entirely on ceremonial architecture, while others produced food, crafted goods, or managed trade networks. The sophistication of these religious centers becomes apparent when archaeologists examine their acoustic properties. Many earthwork enclosures were designed to amplify sound, creating natural amphitheaters where ceremonial chants and music could be heard across great distances. The geometric precision of these acoustic spaces required understanding of sound propagation and architectural engineering that rivals modern concert hall design. Carbon analysis of charcoal deposits within ceremonial sites reveals that ritual fires burned continuously for centuries, maintained by priestly classes who understood the symbolic importance of eternal flames. These fires were not simple bonfires, but carefully managed combustion systems that produced specific types of smoke and light for religious purposes. The fuel sources were selected from particular tree species, some transported from distant forests, indicating ritualized procurement networks spanning the entire Amazon basin. The decline of these magnificent civilizations remains one of archaeology's greatest tragedies. When European diseases swept through indigenous populations in the 16th century, they destroyed not just human lives, but entire knowledge systems accumulated over millennia. Priestly classes who maintained oral traditions died before they could pass their wisdom to successors. Craft specialists who understood complex technologies perished without apprentices. Agricultural systems that had sustained millions of people were abandoned as populations collapsed. The speed of this collapse explains why early European explorers found such different landscapes from those described by their predecessors. Within 50 years of first contact, vast urban networks had been reduced to scattered remnants. Rivers that once flowed past thriving cities now ran through empty forests. Agricultural zones that had fed entire civilizations reverted to wilderness as survivors fled deeper into the jungle or succumbed to disease. But the forest could not completely erase what had taken millennia to create. Beneath the canopy, the geometric patterns remained. In enriched soils, the chemical signatures of ancient agriculture persisted. Among indigenous communities that survived the catastrophe, fragments of traditional knowledge endured in stories, songs, and ceremonial practices passed down through generations. Modern technology has become the key to recovering this lost world. Ground-penetrating radar can detect buried structures without disturbing overlying vegetation. Satellite spectroscopy identifies chemical signatures of ancient settlements from space. Drone-mounted sensors map terrain features invisible to ground-based observers. Each technological advance reveals new layers of complexity in pre-Columbian Amazonian civilization. The most recent discoveries have emerged from the Bolivian Amazon, where international teams using multiple remote sensing technologies have identified what appears to be the largest urban complex yet discovered in the region. Preliminary surveys suggest a metropolitan area covering over 4,000 square kilometers, larger than many modern cities. The complex includes hundreds of settlement mounds connected by raised causeways and surrounded by managed agricultural zones. Initial excavations at the site have yielded artifacts of extraordinary sophistication. Ceramic vessels with intricate polychrome designs rival the finest pottery produced anywhere in the ancient world. Stone tools show evidence of techniques previously unknown in South American archaeology. Gold ornaments display artistic traditions distinct from both Andean and coastal cultures, suggesting independent development of metallurgical expertise. The site's location near major tributaries of the Amazon River would have provided access to trade routes connecting the Andes with the Atlantic coast. Preliminary analysis of artifact materials confirms long-distance exchange relationships. Obsidian from Ecuadorian volcanoes appears alongside copper from Peruvian mines and shells from Caribbean beaches. The settlement functioned as a major commercial hub in networks that span the continent. But perhaps most remarkable are the ecological modifications surrounding the urban core. Aerial surveys reveal landscape alterations extending for hundreds of kilometers in all directions. Ancient inhabitants transformed entire watersheds through controlled burning, selective forest management, and systematic soil enhancement. They created what ecologists now recognize as anthropogenic landscapes, ecosystems shaped by human activity over thousands of years. The scale of these modifications challenges fundamental assumptions about indigenous relationships with natural environments. Rather than living lightly upon the land, Amazonian civilizations actively engineered their surroundings to maximize productivity and sustainability. They created artificial forests optimized for human needs while maintaining biological diversity. They built water management systems that prevented floods while preserving aquatic habitats. They developed agricultural techniques that enriched rather than depleted soil resources. These achievements represent alternative models of human development that avoided the environmental degradation associated with Old World civilizations. Amazonian societies supported populations equivalent to major European cities without deforestation, soil exhaustion, or water pollution. Their techniques offer insights for modern sustainable development in tropical regions facing similar environmental challenges. The rediscovery of Amazonian civilization also illuminates the devastating impact of European colonization on indigenous knowledge systems. The collapse of these sophisticated societies represents one of history's greatest losses of human cultural achievement. Technologies for sustainable agriculture, ecological management, and urban planning developed over millennia vanished within generations of contact with European diseases and colonial policies. Yet fragments of this knowledge survive among contemporary indigenous communities whose ancestors maintain traditional practices despite centuries of pressure to abandon them. Ethnobotanists working with these communities continue to document sophisticated understanding of forest ecology, medicinal plants, and sustainable resource management. Indigenous farmers still employ modified versions of raised field agriculture and terra preta soil enhancement. The challenge facing modern researchers is recovering enough of this traditional knowledge to understand how Amazonian civilizations achieve their remarkable balance between human development and environmental sustainability. Archaeological investigation provides evidence of what they accomplished, but understanding how they did it requires collaboration with indigenous communities who preserve fragments of ancestral wisdom. This collaboration has already yielded insights that are revolutionizing approaches to tropical agriculture and forest management. Techniques developed by ancient Amazonians are being adapted for modern applications in agroforestry, sustainable fisheries, and carbon sequestration. The anthropogenic soils they created are being studied as models for soil remediation and climate change mitigation. The story of Amazonian civilization also demonstrates the resilience of human knowledge and the importance of preserving cultural diversity. Despite catastrophic population collapse and centuries of cultural suppression, indigenous communities maintained connections to their ancestral traditions. Their survival represents not just biological persistence, but the continuation of knowledge systems older than recorded history. As deforestation and climate change threaten the Amazon rainforest, understanding its human history becomes increasingly urgent. The forest that environmentalists seek to preserve is not pristine wilderness, but a cultural landscape shaped by indigenous management over thousands of years. Effective conservation strategies must account for this human dimension and recognize indigenous peoples as partners rather than obstacles in forest preservation. The lost cities of the Amazon are being found not in collapsed stone temples, but in the living traditions of indigenous communities and the enriched soils beneath forest floors. They survive in the geometric patterns visible from space and the ecological relationships that still structure rainforest ecosystems. Recovery of this civilization is not just an archaeological project, but a collaborative effort to understand alternative models of human development that sustained millions of people without destroying their environment. The implications extend far beyond South American archaeology. As humanity faces unprecedented environmental challenges, the example of Amazonian civilization offers hope that sustainable development is possible even at massive scales. Their techniques for forest management, soil enhancement, and water control provide blueprints for addressing modern problems of food security, climate change, and biodiversity loss. But accessing this knowledge requires fundamental changes in how we approach both archaeology and indigenous rights. The treasures of Amazonian civilization cannot be extracted like gold or timber, but must be recovered through respectful collaboration with the communities who are its living heirs. Their participation is not just ethically necessary, but practically essential for understanding technologies that sustained complex societies for over a millennium. The search for the lost cities of the Amazon continues, but the quest has evolved from treasure hunting to knowledge recovery. Each new discovery reveals not ruins to be plundered, but wisdom to be preserved and shared. The greatest treasures hidden beneath the rainforest canopy are not artifacts of gold and jade, but insights into sustainable ways of living that could help secure humanity's future on an increasingly fragile planet. The most profound revelations have emerged not from excavation sites, but from the trees themselves. Botanists analyzing the genetic diversity of Amazon plant species have discovered something extraordinary. What appears to be wild forest is actually a vast orchard cultivated over millennia to produce the foods and medicines that sustain millions. Brazil nut groves cluster around ancient settlement sites with mathematical precision. Cacao trees grow in patterns that could only result from deliberate planting. Medicinal plants concentrate near former villages in arrangements that speak to sophisticated pharmaceutical knowledge. This botanical archaeology reveals a civilization that thought in geological time. They planted forests for their descendants, engineering ecosystems that would provide resources for centuries. The towering Brazil nut trees found throughout the Amazon can live for over 500 years. Their current distribution maps directly onto the locations of pre-Columbian settlements, evidence that ancient inhabitants understood forest succession well enough to plant trees their great-grandchildren would harvest. The same long-term thinking appears in their management of palm species. Throughout the Amazon, certain palms occur in unnaturally high concentrations near archaeological sites. These trees provided everything from construction materials to food to fiber for textiles, but their distribution pattern suggests something remarkable. Ancient foresters had created sustainable harvesting systems that maintained genetic diversity while maximizing productivity. They understood plant breeding techniques that modern agriculture is only beginning to rediscover. Carbon isotope analysis of soil layers reveals the sophisticated fire management these civilizations employed. Rather than clearing forests through destructive burning, they used controlled fires to create forest gardens. These fires were precisely timed and carefully managed to eliminate understory vegetation while preserving canopy trees. The result was park-like forests that combined the productivity of managed landscapes with the ecological complexity of natural systems. The frequency and intensity of these fires were calibrated to promote specific plant communities. Some areas were burned every few years to maintain grasslands for game animals. Others were burned on decade-long cycles to encourage fruit-bearing trees. Still, others were protected from fire entirely to preserve old-growth timber species. This mosaic management created landscapes of extraordinary diversity and productivity. Archaeological evidence suggests that fire management was not left to individual communities, but coordinated across vast regions. Charcoal layers in soil cores show synchronized burning patterns spanning thousands of square kilometers. This required communication networks capable of coordinating activities across territories larger than modern nations. The scale of organization rivals that of contemporary state-level societies. The coordination extended beyond fire management to include water control systems that spanned entire river basins. In the Llanos de Mojos region of Bolivia, recent surveys have mapped canal networks covering over 20,000 square kilometers. These waterways were not random channels, but components of an integrated system that controlled flooding, provided transportation routes, and supported intensive aquaculture. The engineering required to construct these canal systems surpasses many modern infrastructure projects. Ancient hydraulic engineers diverted entire rivers, created artificial lakes, and built causeway bridges that remained functional for centuries. Some canals stretch for over 100 kilometers in perfectly straight lines, requiring surveying techniques of remarkable precision. Others follow contour lines with mathematical accuracy, maintaining gradual slopes that prevented erosion while ensuring adequate water flow. Fish weirs built into these canal systems demonstrate sophisticated understanding of aquatic ecology. These underwater fences were constructed from specially selected woods that would last decades in tropical waters. Their positioning took advantage of seasonal fish migrations, creating natural traps that provided protein for entire communities without depleting fish populations. Some weirs incorporated sophisticated gate systems that could be opened or closed to regulate fish passage. The aquaculture systems they developed integrated fish farming with agriculture in ways that maximize productivity while maintaining ecological balance. Raised agricultural fields were surrounded by canals stocked with multiple fish species. Fish waste fertilized crops, while agricultural runoff provided nutrients for aquatic ecosystems. This closed-loop system achieved levels of efficiency that modern sustainable agriculture struggles to match. Recent discoveries have revealed that these aquaculture systems were not limited to freshwater species. In coastal regions, ancient inhabitants constructed elaborate systems of tidal pools and artificial reefs that supported marine fish farming. Stone fish traps built in tidal zones captured fish during high tide and held them in pools during low tide. These installations required precise understanding of tidal patterns and marine biology. The sophistication of Amazonian aquaculture becomes even more apparent when compared to contemporary fish farming techniques in other parts of the world. While Old World civilizations relied primarily on terrestrial agriculture, Amazonian societies developed integrated systems that maximized both land and water productivity. They understood that tropical ecosystems are most productive when aquatic and terrestrial components function as integrated systems. This integration extended to their urban planning. Cities were not built despite the aquatic environment, but because of it. Settlements were positioned to take advantage of seasonal flooding cycles that brought fertile sediments and fish populations. During flood seasons, cities became Venice-like networks of canals and elevated platforms. During dry seasons, the receding waters revealed agricultural fields enriched by flood deposits. Archaeological mapping of these urban centers reveals planning principles that anticipated seasonal transformation. Buildings were constructed on platforms that remained above flood levels. Storage facilities were positioned to take advantage of natural drainage patterns. Transportation networks included both land-based causeways and water-based canal systems that functioned during different seasons. The largest of these urban centers may have housed populations exceeding 100,000 people, making them among the largest cities in the pre-Columbian Americas. But unlike urban centers in other regions, Amazonian cities achieved this population density without the environmental degradation typically associated with large settlements. Waste management systems incorporated organic refuse into agricultural production. Water supplies remained clean through sophisticated filtration techniques. Air quality was maintained through strategic forest management that prevented smoke accumulation. The technological achievements of these urban centers become apparent through analysis of their craft production. Ceramic workshops produced pottery of extraordinary technical sophistication. Some vessels were fired at temperatures exceeding 1,200 degrees Celsius, requiring kiln technologies that would not be redeveloped in the Americas until the colonial period. The glazes applied to these ceramics incorporated mineral compounds that could only be obtained through long-distance trade networks. Textile production reached similar levels of sophistication. Fiber analysis of preserved fabric fragments reveals weaving techniques that produce textiles of exceptional fineness and durability. Some fabrics incorporated metallic threads made from hammered gold and silver. Others used vegetable dyes that have maintained their colors for over 1,000 years. The complexity of these textiles required specialized looms and highly skilled artisans working full-time in textile production. Metallurgy represents perhaps the most remarkable achievement of Amazonian technology. Despite the region's limited metal ore deposits, ancient inhabitants developed sophisticated techniques for working gold, silver, and copper. They created alloys with properties superior to pure metals and developed casting techniques that produced objects of extraordinary complexity and beauty. Recent analysis of pre-Columbian metal objects from the Amazon has revealed technologies previously unknown in South American metallurgy. Some artifacts show evidence of electrochemical plating techniques that were not rediscovered until the 19th century. Others incorporate metals that could only be obtained through chemical processes of remarkable sophistication. The source of raw materials for this metallurgical industry reveals trade networks of continental scope. Copper came from mines in the Andes over 2,000 kilometers away. Gold originated in deposits throughout South America and possibly the Caribbean. Silver arrived from sources as distant as Mexico. The logistics required to maintain these supply chains over such distances speaks to commercial organizations of extraordinary complexity. Trade goods moved along routes that connected the Amazon with every major cultural region in the Americas. Amazonian products, including exotic feathers, medicinal plants, and manufactured goods, have been found in archaeological sites from the Arctic to Patagonia. This continental trade network facilitated not just the exchange of goods, but the spread of technologies, ideas, and cultural practices. The sophistication of these trade networks becomes apparent through analysis of standardized measurement systems found throughout the Amazon basin. Ceramic vessels show consistent size ratios across sites separated by thousands of kilometers. Stone tools conform to standardized proportions that suggest shared manufacturing techniques. Even architectural elements display modular dimensions that allowed components to be prefabricated in one location and assembled in another. This standardization required central authorities capable of enforcing uniform specifications across vast territories. Archaeological evidence suggests the existence of political confederations that coordinated activities among dozens of separate communities. These confederations were not empires in the traditional sense, but voluntary associations that facilitated trade, shared technologies, and coordinated responses to environmental challenges. The political structures that govern these confederations remain largely mysterious, but archaeological evidence suggests systems that balance central coordination with local autonomy. Ceremonial centers served as neutral meeting grounds where representatives from different communities could gather to negotiate agreements and resolve disputes. These centers were positioned at strategic locations that provided equal access to all member communities. The ceremonies conducted at these centers combined religious rituals with commercial and political activities. Archaeological deposits reveal feasting events that brought together thousands of participants from across the Confederation. These gatherings served multiple functions, reinforcing social bonds, facilitating trade negotiations, and demonstrating the wealth and power of participating communities. The scale of these ceremonial events required logistical capabilities that rival modern political conventions. Participants had to be housed, fed, and transported across vast distances. Food supplies sufficient to feed thousands of people had to be accumulated and prepared. Security arrangements had to prevent conflicts among groups with different cultural traditions and potentially competing interests. The success of these gatherings depended on sophisticated communication systems that could coordinate activities across the Confederation. Archaeological evidence suggests the use of complex signaling systems that employed smoke, drums, and reflected sunlight to transmit messages across great distances. Some signal stations were positioned on elevated platforms that provided visual contact with multiple other stations. creating networks capable of rapid, long-distance communication. These communication networks also facilitated the spread of astronomical knowledge that appears consistently across Amazonian archaeological sites. Many settlements show evidence of sophisticated astronomical observations that tracked solar, lunar, and stellar cycles with remarkable precision. This knowledge was essential for agricultural planning, ceremonial timing, and navigation along the complex network of waterways. The astronomical sophistication of Amazonian civilizations becomes apparent through analysis of their ceremonial architecture. Many earthwork complexes incorporate multiple astronomical alignments that mark important seasonal transitions. The largest complexes function as massive calendars that track celestial events over multi-year cycles. Some alignments mark events that occur only once in human lifetimes, suggesting astronomical knowledge accumulated over many generations. This long-term astronomical observation required institutional continuity that spanned centuries. Priestly classes or specialized astronomers maintained observation programs that continued despite political changes and natural disasters. The knowledge they accumulated was encoded not just in oral traditions, but in the permanent architecture of ceremonial centers. The precision of these astronomical alignments rivals that achieved by contemporary civilizations in other parts of the world. Some earthwork complexes mark solar positions with accuracy measured in fractions of degrees. Lunar alignments track the complex 18.6-year cycle of lunar standstills with mathematical precision. Stellar alignments follow the precession of equinoxes over periods spanning thousands of years. This astronomical knowledge had practical applications that extended far beyond ceremonial purposes. Agricultural timing depended on accurate seasonal predictions. Navigation along river networks required understanding of stellar positions. Flood predictions relied on correlations between celestial events and hydrological cycles. The survival of millions of people depended on the accuracy of these astronomical observations. The integration of astronomical knowledge with practical activities reveals civilizations that understood the connections between celestial mechanics and terrestrial phenomena. They recognized that seasonal cycles, weather patterns, and ecological rhythms were all connected to the movements of celestial bodies. This holistic understanding allowed them to develop technologies and social systems that worked in harmony with natural cycles rather than in opposition to them. The collapse of this astronomical knowledge represents one of the greatest intellectual losses in human history. When epidemic diseases destroyed the populations that maintained these observation systems, centuries of accumulated wisdom vanished within decades. The precise understanding of celestial mechanics that had guided agricultural and social activities for over a millennium was lost, leaving only the stone monuments that encoded fragments of this knowledge. Modern archaeoastronomers working to decode these monuments face the challenge of reconstructing knowledge systems without the cultural context that gave them meaning. The geometric alignments are clear, but their significance within the broader framework of Amazonian cosmology remains largely mysterious. Understanding these monuments requires not just astronomical calculation, but anthropological insight into the worldviews that created them. Recent collaborations between archaeologists and contemporary indigenous astronomers have begun to unlock some of these mysteries. Many indigenous communities maintain oral traditions that preserve fragments of ancestral astronomical knowledge. Elders describe celestial observations that correlate with agricultural activities, ceremonial timing, and seasonal preparations. These living traditions provide keys to understanding the monuments left by their ancestors. The recovery of this knowledge has practical implications that extend far beyond academic archaeology. Traditional astronomical knowledge includes understanding of weather patterns, seasonal variations, and ecological cycles that could inform modern climate science. Indigenous observations of celestial events often correlate with environmental phenomena in ways that modern meteorology is only beginning to understand. The agricultural applications of traditional astronomical knowledge are particularly relevant to contemporary sustainable farming initiatives. Indigenous farmers continue to use celestial observations to time planting, harvesting, and land management activities. Their techniques, refined over centuries of observation, often achieve better results than modern scientific approaches that rely primarily on statistical weather data. The integration of traditional knowledge with modern technology offers possibilities for developing more effective approaches to environmental management in tropical regions. Satellite technology can extend the reach of traditional observation techniques, while indigenous knowledge can provide cultural context for interpreting scientific data. This collaboration could lead to breakthrough understanding of Amazonian ecology and sustainable development practices. But accessing traditional knowledge requires relationships of trust and mutual respect that have been damaged by centuries of colonial exploitation. Indigenous communities have learned to be cautious about sharing cultural information with outsiders who may not understand its sacred significance or may use it for purposes that conflict with community values. Building these relationships requires fundamental changes in how archaeological research is conducted. Instead of extracting information from sites and communities, researchers must engage in genuine partnerships that benefit indigenous peoples as well as scientific understanding. This means recognizing indigenous intellectual property rights, sharing research benefits with communities, and conducting investigations according to cultural protocols that respect indigenous values. The shift toward collaborative research has already begun to transform understanding of Amazonian civilization. Indigenous knowledge holders provide insights that would be impossible to obtain through archaeological investigation alone. They understand the cultural significance of landscape features, the meaning of artistic symbols, and the practical applications of traditional technologies. This collaboration has revealed that the lost cities of the Amazon were never truly lost to the indigenous communities who are their descendants. Oral traditions preserve detailed knowledge of ancient settlements, trade routes, and ceremonial centers. Place names encode information about former land use patterns and ecological relationships. Cultural practices maintain connections to ancestral technologies and worldviews. The challenge facing contemporary research is not discovering a lost civilization, but recognizing that it never completely disappeared. The cities disappear may be overgrown and the populations decimated, but the knowledge systems that created them survive in modified forms among indigenous communities throughout the Amazon. Recovery of this civilization requires not just archaeological excavation, but cultural revitalization that empowers indigenous peoples to reclaim and share their ancestral heritage. This process of cultural recovery has implications that extend far beyond the Amazon basin. Throughout the Americas, indigenous communities maintain connections to ancestral knowledge systems that were suppressed but not eliminated by European colonization. These knowledge systems offer alternative approaches to agriculture, medicine, environmental management, and social organization that could address many of the challenges facing contemporary society. The rediscovery of Amazonian civilization thus represents more than an archaeological achievement. It demonstrates the resilience of indigenous knowledge and the importance of cultural diversity for human survival. The technologies and social systems developed by pre-Columbian Amazonians offer models for sustainable development that could help address contemporary environmental challenges while respecting the rights and knowledge of indigenous peoples. The scope of this cultural recovery extends beyond individual communities to encompass entire linguistic families scattered across the Amazon basin. Languages that linguists once considered unrelated are revealing shared vocabularies related to agricultural techniques, astronomical observations, and architectural construction. These linguistic connections map onto the same geographical networks identified through archaeological surveys, suggesting that cultural exchange in pre-Columbian Amazonia operated on scales comparable to modern international systems. When comparative linguists analyzed terms for specific technologies across different Amazonian language groups, patterns emerge that illuminate ancient knowledge networks. Words for raised field construction techniques appear in languages separated by thousands of kilometers. Terminology for astronomical observations shows cognates among groups with no apparent historical contact. Even more striking are shared vocabularies for complex metallurgical processes, suggesting that technical knowledge spread along trade routes that connected distant communities. The preservation of these linguistic fossils in contemporary indigenous languages provides archaeologists with invaluable clues for interpreting material remains. When excavations uncover unfamiliar tools or architectural features, linguistic analysis can often reveal their functions through comparison with terms preserved in oral traditions. This approach has identified agricultural implements, ceremonial objects, and construction techniques that would otherwise remain mysterious. But language preservation faces the same threats that endanger archaeological sites. As younger generations adopt dominant languages for economic opportunities, traditional vocabularies disappear along with the cultural knowledge they encode. Linguists working in the Amazon report that technical terms related to traditional technologies are vanishing faster than general vocabulary, as these specialized knowledge domains are no longer transmitted to new generations. The urgency of this linguistic archaeology becomes apparent when considering the rate of language loss in the Amazon basin. Conservative estimates suggest that over half of the region's indigenous languages have disappeared since European contact. Each lost language represents the elimination of unique perspectives on environmental management, social organization, and technological innovation developed over millennia of cultural evolution. Recent initiatives to document endangered languages have revealed the extraordinary sophistication of indigenous knowledge systems. Communities that appear to live simple subsistence lifestyles often maintain vocabularies of thousands of terms related to ecological relationships, seasonal variations, and resource management techniques. This linguistic complexity reflects detailed understanding of environmental processes that rivals modern scientific knowledge in many domains. The integration of linguistic and archaeological evidence has begun to reconstruct social networks that connected pre-Columbian Amazonian societies across vast distances. Shared loanwords indicate regular contact between communities separated by geographic barriers that seem insurmountable to modern transportation. Trade relationships, marriage alliances, and ceremonial exchanges created webs of interaction that spanned the entire basin. These networks facilitated not just the exchange of goods and genetic material, but the spread of innovations that transformed entire regions. New agricultural techniques developed in one area could spread rapidly through established communication channels. Ceremonial practices originating in specific communities diffused along trade routes to influence religious traditions across multiple language groups. Even artistic styles show evidence of cross-cultural transmission that created shared aesthetic traditions spanning thousands of square kilometers. The mechanisms that maintain these long-distance relationships reveal sophisticated diplomatic institutions that prevented conflicts from disrupting essential exchange networks. Archaeological evidence suggests the existence of neutral trading zones where different groups could meet safely to conduct business. These areas were often associated with major ceremonial centers that provided ritual frameworks for peaceful interaction among potentially hostile communities. The ceremonial aspects of these trading relationships extended beyond simple commercial transactions to encompass elaborate gift exchanges that reinforce social bonds between distant communities. Archaeological deposits at major trading centers contain exotic goods that clearly serve ceremonial rather than practical functions. Elaborate featherwork from distant regions, precious stones with no local utility, and ceremonial objects requiring specialized knowledge to use all appear in context suggesting ritual rather than commercial exchange. These gift exchanges followed protocols that balanced reciprocity with hierarchy, creating stable relationships that could survive political changes and natural disasters. Communities that controlled access to rare resources gained prestige that translated into political influence within regional networks. But this influence came with obligations to share resources during emergencies and to provide hospitality for travelers and traders. The sophistication of these diplomatic systems becomes apparent through analysis of conflict resolution mechanisms encoded in oral traditions. Many indigenous communities preserve detailed accounts of ancient disputes and their resolutions. These stories reveal formal procedures for addressing grievances, compensating victims, and preventing conflicts from escalating into warfare. The procedures often involved neutral mediators from distant communities who had no stake in local disputes. Archaeological evidence supports these oral traditions through analysis of defensive installations that appear designed more for symbolic display than actual warfare. Many fortified sites could not have withstood serious military assault, but would have been effective for demonstrating power and discouraging casual aggression. This suggests that conflict resolution relied more on negotiation and face-saving measures than on military force. The emphasis on peaceful conflict resolution may explain how Amazonian societies maintain stable trading relationships across such vast distances without the centralized military forces that characterize state-level societies in other regions. Instead of relying on imperial armies to enforce order, they developed diplomatic institutions that made warfare economically and socially costly, while providing alternative mechanisms for resolving disputes. These diplomatic systems also facilitated the spread of technological innovations that required coordinated implementation across multiple communities. The construction of inter-regional canal systems, for example, would have required agreements among dozens of separate groups about labor contributions, resource allocation, and maintenance responsibilities. The archaeological evidence suggests that such agreements were not only reached, but maintained for centuries. The collapse of these diplomatic networks following European contact may explain why post-contact indigenous communities appeared so fragmented and isolated to colonial observers. The epidemic diseases that decimated indigenous populations also destroyed the institutional knowledge required to maintain long-distance relationships. Communities that had once been integrated into continental trading networks found themselves isolated and vulnerable to external pressures. The recovery of pre-Columbian diplomatic traditions offers insights for contemporary efforts to promote indigenous rights and cultural survival. Many current indigenous political movements draw explicitly on ancestral traditions of inter-community cooperation and resource sharing. These movements adapt traditional diplomatic practices to address modern challenges while maintaining cultural authenticity. The success of these contemporary indigenous movements demonstrates that pre-Columbian political institutions were not simply artifacts of historical interest, but living traditions that continue to evolve and adapt. The same principles that once coordinated activities among hundreds of autonomous communities now organize indigenous responses to mining companies, land invasions, and government policies that threaten traditional territories. Modern technology has become a powerful tool for revitalizing these traditional political networks. Satellite phones allow isolated communities to maintain contact with regional organizations. Internet connections enable indigenous leaders to coordinate activities across international borders. GPS devices help communities document traditional territories and resource use patterns for legal proceedings. But technology alone cannot restore the cultural knowledge that once sustained these networks. The institutions that maintained pre-Columbian diplomatic relationships depended on shared worldviews, ceremonial practices, and social obligations that were transmitted through generations of cultural apprenticeship. Reconstructing these knowledge systems requires intensive collaboration between elders who preserve traditional knowledge and younger generations who must adapt it to contemporary circumstances. This process of cultural reconstruction faces significant challenges from external pressures that continue to threaten indigenous communities. Illegal mining, logging, and agriculture destroy not just physical archaeological sites, but the landscapes that provide context for traditional knowledge. Climate change alters seasonal patterns that have guided indigenous practices for centuries. Political instability undermines the long-term planning required for cultural transmission. Despite these challenges, indigenous communities throughout the Amazon continue to maintain and adapt their ancestral traditions. New generations of indigenous scholars are combining traditional knowledge with modern academic training to document and preserve cultural heritage. Indigenous organizations are developing educational programs that transmit traditional knowledge while preparing young people for participation in contemporary society. The results of these efforts extend far beyond cultural preservation to encompass practical solutions for contemporary environmental challenges. Traditional fire management techniques are being adapted for modern forest conservation programs. Indigenous agricultural methods are providing models for sustainable farming in tropical regions. Traditional resource management systems are informing modern approaches to biodiversity conservation. The integration of traditional knowledge with modern science has already produced breakthrough discoveries in multiple fields. Pharmaceutical companies are developing new medicines based on indigenous plant knowledge. Agricultural researchers are adapting traditional soil management techniques for modern farming systems. Environmental scientists are incorporating indigenous observations into climate change research. But accessing traditional knowledge for these purposes requires recognition of indigenous intellectual property rights and equitable benefit-sharing agreements. Indigenous communities are increasingly assertive about maintaining control over their cultural heritage and ensuring that commercial applications of traditional knowledge provide benefits to the communities that preserved it. The legal frameworks for protecting indigenous knowledge are still evolving, but successful models are emerging that balance community rights with broader social benefits. These agreements typically involve long-term partnerships that provide communities with ongoing compensation for knowledge sharing, while ensuring that traditional practices are not exploited or misrepresented. The broader implications of this work extend to fundamental questions about intellectual property, cultural heritage, and the relationship between traditional and modern knowledge systems. The sophistication of pre-Columbian Amazonian civilizations challenges Western assumptions about the relationship between technological development and environmental impact. These societies achieved remarkable technological sophistication while maintaining sustainable relationships with their environment. Their example demonstrates that high levels of social complexity and technological achievement are compatible with environmental sustainability when development occurs within cultural frameworks that prioritize long-term ecological health over short-term resource extraction. This insight has profound implications for contemporary efforts to address climate change and biodiversity loss, while maintaining human welfare and technological progress. The technologies developed by pre-Columbian Amazonians offer specific models for sustainable development that could be adapted for modern applications. Their soil management techniques could revolutionize agriculture in tropical regions. Their water management systems could inform flood control and irrigation projects. Their forest management practices could guide conservation efforts while maintaining forest productivity. But implementing these technologies requires more than technical knowledge. It requires understanding of the cultural context that made them effective. Pre-Columbian Amazonian societies succeeded not just because they had sophisticated technologies, but because they had social institutions that ensured those technologies were used sustainably over long time periods. The social mechanisms that prevented over-exploitation of resources included ceremonial practices that reinforced conservation ethics, political institutions that balanced competing interests, and economic systems that distributed resources equitably. These cultural innovations were as important as technological ones for maintaining sustainable relationships with the environment. Understanding these social technologies requires collaboration with indigenous communities that maintain connections to ancestral worldviews and practices. Their perspectives provide essential insights into how traditional knowledge systems integrated technical knowledge with social values and spiritual beliefs to create coherent approaches to environmental management. This collaboration has revealed that indigenous knowledge is not simply a collection of practical techniques, but a comprehensive worldview that understands human societies as components of larger ecological and cosmic systems. This holistic perspective provides frameworks for addressing contemporary challenges that require integration of social, environmental, and spiritual dimensions. The recovery of pre-Columbian Amazonian civilization thus represents more than an archaeological project. It offers pathways toward more sustainable and equitable approaches to human development that could address many of the challenges facing contemporary society. The lost cities of the Amazon may be overgrown, but their greatest treasures, the knowledge systems that created them, remain accessible through collaboration with the indigenous communities who are their living heirs. The continuing discovery of new archaeological sites throughout the Amazon ensures that this process of knowledge recovery will continue for generations. Each new revelation adds pieces to a puzzle that grows more complex and more remarkable with every investigation. Remote sensing technologies continue to identify previously unknown sites, while ground-based research reveals the sophistication of ancient technologies and social systems. But perhaps the most important discoveries are not archaeological sites, but the recognition that indigenous communities throughout the Amazon maintain living connections to one of humanity's most remarkable civilizations. Their knowledge, their languages, their cultural practices preserve fragments of wisdom that could help guide humanity toward more sustainable relationships with the natural world. The challenge facing contemporary society is not simply discovering what was lost, but recognizing what has been preserved and ensuring that it continues to thrive. The greatest treasures of Amazonian civilization are not buried beneath the forest floor, but maintained in the minds and practices of indigenous peoples who carry forward traditions older than recorded history. Their survival represents not just the persistence of human communities, but the continuation of knowledge systems that understood the Amazon not as wilderness to be conquered, but as a partner in an intricate dance of reciprocity. This partnership shaped every aspect of pre-Columbian life, from the smallest decisions about which plants to cultivate to the grand architectural projects that transformed entire landscapes. The sophistication of this partnership becomes apparent when modern ecologists study the current composition of Amazon rainforest. Computer models analyzing the distribution of useful plant species reveal patterns that cannot be explained by natural processes alone. Brazil nut trees, for instance, occur in clusters that correlate precisely with archaeological sites dating back over 1,000 years. These trees, which for centuries were can live clearly planted by ancient inhabitants who understood forest succession well enough to engineer ecosystems for their descendants. The same intentionality appears in the distribution of medicinal plants throughout the region. Ethnobotanists working with contemporary indigenous healers have mapped the locations of therapeutic species and found that their concentrations follow the same patterns as ancient settlements. Plants used to treat specific ailments cluster around former villages in arrangements that could only result from deliberate cultivation over many generations. This pharmaceutical landscape represents one of humanity's oldest and most sophisticated medical systems. Recent analysis of traditional healing practices has revealed that indigenous communities employ over 3,000 plant species for medicinal purposes. Many of these plants contain compounds that modern pharmaceutical science has only recently begun to understand. Some have proven effective against diseases that conventional medicine struggles to treat. The knowledge required to identify, prepare, and administer these plant medicines represents centuries of careful observation and experimentation. Indigenous healers must understand not only which plants possess therapeutic properties, but how those properties change with seasonal variations, preparation methods, and combinations with other species. This knowledge was accumulated through generations of systematic investigation that rivals modern clinical research in its rigor and scope. The preservation of this medical knowledge through the catastrophic population decline following European contact represents one of the most remarkable achievements in the history of human culture. Despite losing up to 90% of their populations to epidemic diseases, indigenous communities managed to maintain healing traditions that had taken millennia to develop. Shamans and healers somehow preserved detailed pharmaceutical knowledge even as the social structures that had supported their training collapsed around them. Modern researchers studying these healing traditions have discovered that indigenous medical systems often achieve better outcomes than conventional treatments for certain conditions. Traditional approaches to mental health, for example, integrate spiritual, social, and pharmacological interventions in ways that address root causes rather than just symptoms. Their holistic approach recognizes connections between individual health and community well-being that modern medicine is only beginning to acknowledge. The integration of spiritual and practical elements in traditional medicine reflects broader patterns in pre-Columbian Amazonian thought. These societies did not separate sacred and secular knowledge into distinct categories, but understood all aspects of life as interconnected manifestations of underlying cosmic principles. Their architecture, agriculture, and social organization all reflected the same holistic worldview that guided their medical practices. This integration of spiritual and practical knowledge extended to their understanding of time itself. Archaeological evidence suggests that pre-Columbian Amazonians operated according to multiple overlapping temporal frameworks that included daily cycles, seasonal patterns, generational rhythms, and cosmic ages spanning thousands of years. Their long-term planning capabilities enabled them to undertake projects that required decades or centuries to complete. The most striking example of this temporal sophistication appears in their forest management practices. Creating the anthropogenic forests that still dominate much of the Amazon required planning that extended across multiple human generations. Ancient foresters had to understand not only which species to plant, but when those species would reach maturity and how their growth would affect other components of the ecosystem of the trees. Some they planted would not have produced significant yields for 50 or more years after planting. Others required specific succession sequences that took decades to establish. The coordination required to maintain such long-term projects across multiple generations speaks to institutional continuity and cultural stability that modern societies rarely achieve. The mechanisms that sustain this institutional continuity become apparent through analysis of ceremonial practices that continue among contemporary indigenous communities. Many rituals explicitly connect present actions with ancestral obligations and future responsibilities. Participants understand themselves as links in chains of reciprocity that extend backward and forward through time. These ceremonial frameworks provided the cultural foundation for sustainable resource management by embedding practical activities within spiritual contexts that emphasized long-term consequences. Decisions about land use, resource extraction, and community development were made within ritual settings that required consideration of impacts on future generations. The effectiveness of these cultural mechanisms becomes apparent when comparing the environmental outcomes of pre-Columbian and post-contact land use in the Amazon. Archaeological evidence shows that indigenous management maintained forest cover and biodiversity for over a millennium while supporting populations that may have exceeded current levels. In contrast, modern development has caused more deforestation in 50 years than occurred during the previous 1,000. The difference lies not just in technology, but in the temporal frameworks that guide decision-making. Pre-Columbian societies operated according to cultural values that prioritized long-term sustainability over short-term gains. Their economic systems were designed to maintain resource flows across generations rather than maximize immediate extraction. These economic systems incorporated sophisticated understanding of ecological limits and carrying capacity. Archaeological analysis of ancient settlements reveals evidence of population control mechanisms that prevented communities from growing beyond their environmental support capacity. These mechanisms included ceremonial practices, marriage customs, and resource allocation systems that maintain demographic balance. The social institutions that enforced these limits were embedded within religious frameworks that understood human prosperity as dependent on maintaining proper relationships with natural forces. Violations of environmental taboos were not just practical mistakes, but spiritual transgressions that threatened community survival. Contemporary indigenous communities maintain modified versions of these institutional frameworks that continue to promote sustainable resource use. Their traditional territories consistently show higher levels of biodiversity and forest cover than adjacent areas under different management regimes. This outcome reflects not just traditional knowledge, but ongoing commitment to cultural values that prioritize ecological health. The success of indigenous conservation efforts has gained recognition from international environmental organizations seeking alternatives to conventional conservation strategies. Traditional territorial management combines effective biodiversity protection with sustainable resource extraction in ways that benefit both local communities and global environmental goals. But implementing traditional management systems requires recognition of indigenous territorial rights and support for cultural revitalization efforts. Communities cannot maintain traditional practices without access to the landscapes that provide context for their knowledge and the social institutions that transmit it across generations. The legal frameworks required to support traditional management are complex, because they must balance indigenous rights with national sovereignty and international environmental commitments. Successful models typically involve co-management agreements that recognize indigenous authority over traditional territories while providing technical and financial support for conservation activities. These agreements have produced remarkable conservation outcomes in regions where they have been implemented. Indigenous territories in the Amazon currently contain some of the world's most intact tropical forest ecosystems. Deforestation rates within indigenous lands are typically much lower than in adjacent areas under other management regimes. The conservation effectiveness of traditional management reflects not just cultural commitment, but sophisticated technical knowledge about forest ecology and sustainable resource use. Indigenous communities understand forest dynamics at levels of detail that complement and often exceed scientific knowledge. Their understanding of plant-animal interactions, seasonal variations, and disturbance cycles provides essential information for ecosystem management. Traditional ecological calendars track hundreds of species through annual cycles of reproduction, migration, and resource availability. This knowledge enables precise timing of harvest activities that maintain population viability while providing community resources. The precision of traditional ecological knowledge becomes apparent when researchers compare indigenous observations with scientific monitoring data. Indigenous informants consistently provide more detailed and accurate information about species behavior, population trends, and environmental changes than scientific surveys conducted over similar time periods. This accuracy reflects observation systems that have been refined over many generations of intensive field experience. Traditional knowledge holders spend their entire lives observing specific ecosystems and inherit detailed information from predecessors who made similar observations over decades. The cumulative result is understanding of ecological processes that surpasses what any individual scientific career could achieve. The integration of traditional and scientific knowledge has proven essential for effective conservation in tropical regions, where species diversity exceeds the capacity of conventional scientific approaches. Traditional knowledge provides detailed information about rare and cryptic species that scientific surveys often miss. It also offers historical baselines for ecosystem conditions that predate scientific monitoring. But accessing traditional knowledge requires long-term collaborative relationships that respect indigenous intellectual property and provide equitable benefits to knowledge holders. These relationships must be based on mutual respect and recognition of traditional knowledge as intellectually equivalent to scientific knowledge rather than merely supplementary to it. The development of such relationships has been complicated by histories of exploitation that make indigenous communities justifiably cautious about sharing cultural information with outsiders. Building trust requires demonstrated commitment to indigenous rights and genuine partnership in research design and implementation. Successful collaborations typically evolve through extended periods of relationship building, during which researchers demonstrate respect for cultural protocols and commitment to community goals. These relationships often extend beyond specific research projects to encompass broader support for cultural revitalization and territorial rights. The benefits of such collaborations extend beyond conservation to encompass broader understanding of human-environment relationships. Traditional knowledge systems offer alternative frameworks for understanding ecological processes that can inform more effective environmental management strategies. These frameworks typically emphasize interconnections and feedback loops that conventional scientific approaches sometimes overlook. Traditional understanding recognizes that ecological, social, and spiritual dimensions of environmental systems are interconnected in ways that require integrated management approaches. The holistic perspective embedded in traditional knowledge becomes increasingly relevant as environmental challenges require responses that address social and ecological dimensions simultaneously. Climate change, biodiversity loss, and environmental degradation cannot be addressed through technical solutions alone, but require changes in human behavior and social organization. Traditional knowledge systems offer models for social organization that maintain sustainable relationships with environmental systems over long time periods. These models demonstrate that human societies can achieve high levels of cultural sophistication while maintaining ecological sustainability when development occurs within appropriate cultural frameworks. The challenge facing contemporary society is adapting traditional models to address modern environmental problems while respecting the cultural contexts that make them effective. This requires genuine partnership with indigenous communities rather than simple extraction of traditional techniques for external application. Such partnerships offer possibilities for developing new approaches to environmental management that integrate traditional wisdom with modern technology. Remote sensing systems can extend the reach of traditional monitoring, while traditional knowledge can provide cultural context for interpreting scientific data. The combination of satellite technology with traditional ecological knowledge has already produced breakthrough understanding of forest dynamics, species distribution, and environmental change. Indigenous observations provide ground truth for satellite data, while satellite imagery extends traditional monitoring to larger spatial scales. Similar integration possibilities exist for other environmental management challenges. Traditional fire management techniques can inform modern approaches to forest conservation. Indigenous soil management practices can guide sustainable agriculture initiatives. Traditional water management systems can inform flood control and irrigation projects. But realizing these possibilities requires fundamental changes in how research and development occur. Instead of extracting traditional knowledge for external application, researchers must engage in genuine partnerships that empower indigenous communities to adapt their traditions to address contemporary challenges. The most successful examples of such partnerships involve indigenous communities taking leadership roles in research, design, and implementation, while collaborating with external technical experts. These arrangements ensure that traditional knowledge is applied within appropriate cultural contexts while benefiting from modern technical capabilities. The outcomes of such collaborations often exceed what either traditional or modern approaches could achieve independently. Traditional knowledge provides detailed understanding of local conditions, while modern technology enables application at larger scales. Traditional values ensure long-term sustainability, while modern techniques enable rapid adaptation to changing conditions. The integration of traditional and modern approaches also produces more robust solutions that can adapt to unexpected challenges. Traditional knowledge systems include understanding of environmental variability and uncertainty that enables flexible responses to changing conditions. Modern technology provides monitoring and communication capabilities that enable rapid information sharing and coordinated responses. The resilience of integrated approaches becomes particularly important as environmental conditions become increasingly unpredictable due to climate change and other global processes. Traditional knowledge includes understanding of how ecosystems respond to major disturbances, while modern science provides tools for predicting and monitoring such events. The combination enables development of adaptive management strategies that can respond effectively to both gradual environmental changes and sudden disruptions. These strategies typically include multiple contingency plans based on traditional understanding of environmental variability and modern modeling of possible future scenarios. The effectiveness of adaptive management approaches has been demonstrated in several indigenous territories, where traditional knowledge has been combined with modern monitoring technology to address environmental challenges. These projects have achieved conservation outcomes that exceed results from conventional approaches while maintaining cultural authenticity and community control. The success of these initiatives has attracted attention from international development agencies seeking more effective approaches to environmental management in developing countries. Traditional knowledge systems offer models for community-based management that achieve environmental goals while promoting social equity and cultural preservation. But scaling up traditional approaches requires careful attention to the cultural contexts that make them effective. Traditional management systems cannot be simply transplanted from one location to another, but must be adapted to local conditions and cultural frameworks. The adaptation process requires intensive collaboration between communities, researchers, and development practitioners to identify which elements of traditional systems can be effectively transferred and how they must be modified for different contexts. This process often takes years to complete and requires long-term commitment from all participants. The investment required for such collaborations reflects the complexity of traditional knowledge systems and the time needed to understand their cultural contexts. But the outcomes justify the effort by producing management approaches that are both more effective and more sustainable than conventional alternatives. The long-term benefits of integrating traditional and modern approaches extend beyond environmental outcomes to encompass cultural revitalization and social empowerment. Communities that successfully adapt traditional knowledge to address contemporary challenges often experience renewed cultural pride and strengthened social institutions. This cultural strengthening creates positive feedback loops that enhance the effectiveness of environmental management while promoting community well-being. Strong cultural institutions provide the social foundation for long-term environmental stewardship, while successful environmental management reinforces cultural values and traditional knowledge. The interplay between cultural and environmental outcomes reflects the holistic nature of traditional knowledge systems that understand human and natural systems as interconnected components of larger wholes. This perspective offers essential insights for addressing contemporary challenges that require integration of social and environmental dimensions. The recognition of these interconnections has begun to influence mainstream environmental policy and practice. International agreements increasingly acknowledge the importance of indigenous knowledge for biodiversity conservation and climate change adaptation. Development agencies are incorporating traditional knowledge into project design and implementation. But translating recognition into effective action requires institutional changes that enable meaningful participation of indigenous communities in environmental governance. These changes must address power imbalances that have historically marginalized indigenous voices while providing resources and technical support for community-based initiatives. The institutional innovations required for effective collaboration are still evolving, but successful models are emerging that balance community autonomy with broader environmental goals. These models typically involve formal recognition of indigenous territorial rights, combined with technical and financial support for traditional management practices. The effectiveness of such arrangements depends on genuine commitment to power sharing and recognition of indigenous knowledge as intellectually equivalent to scientific knowledge. This requires fundamental changes in institutional cultures that have traditionally privileged Western scientific approaches over traditional knowledge systems. The cultural changes required for effective collaboration are as important as the technical and legal innovations. Researchers, policymakers, and development practitioners must develop genuine respect for traditional knowledge and recognition of indigenous peoples as intellectual equals rather than simply sources of information. This cultural transformation is already underway in many institutions as the effectiveness of traditional knowledge becomes increasingly apparent. Universities are developing new programs that integrate indigenous and Western knowledge systems. Research institutions are creating positions for indigenous knowledge holders. Government agencies are establishing formal consultation processes with indigenous communities. The institutional changes reflect growing recognition that addressing contemporary environmental challenges requires knowledge systems that can operate effectively across multiple scales and cultural contexts. No single approach, whether traditional or modern, contains sufficient knowledge to address the complexity of current environmental problems. The integration of different knowledge systems offers possibilities for developing more comprehensive understanding of environmental processes and more effective management strategies. But this integration must occur within frameworks that respect the cultural integrity of traditional knowledge, while enabling productive collaboration with modern science. The development of such frameworks represents one of the most important challenges facing environmental management in the 21st century. The outcome will determine whether humanity can develop sustainable relationships with natural systems that support both human well-being and ecological integrity. The Amazon basin, with its combination of extraordinary biodiversity and sophisticated indigenous knowledge systems, offers an ideal laboratory for developing integrated approaches to environmental management. The region's history demonstrates both the possibilities for sustainable human development and the consequences of ignoring traditional wisdom. The lost cities that once flourished beneath the forest canopy achieved remarkable balance between human needs and environmental health through knowledge systems that understood ecological relationships in extraordinary detail. Their collapse following European contact illustrates the fragility of such systems when confronted by external disruptions. But the survival of indigenous communities and their knowledge traditions offers hope that sustainable relationships between human societies and natural systems can be rebuilt. The challenge is creating institutional frameworks that enable traditional knowledge to inform contemporary environmental management while adapting to changed conditions. The urgency of this challenge grows daily as deforestation, climate change, and biodiversity loss accelerate throughout the Amazon basin. Without rapid action to protect both ecological systems and indigenous knowledge, humanity may lose forever the wisdom accumulated over millennia of sustainable living in tropical forests. The window of opportunity for such action is narrowing as older generations of knowledge holders pass away, and younger generations lose connection to traditional practices. But initiatives throughout the region demonstrate that cultural revitalization is possible when communities receive appropriate support and recognition. The key lies in understanding greatest that the treasures of Amazonian civilization were never gold or precious stones, but knowledge systems that enabled millions of people to live in harmony with one of Earth's most complex ecosystems. That knowledge survives in modified forms among indigenous communities who carry forward traditions older than recorded history. Their wisdom offers pathways toward more sustainable approaches to human development that could help address the environmental challenges facing all of humanity. But accessing that wisdom requires recognizing indigenous peoples as partners in creating solutions rather than simply sources of information to be extracted and applied elsewhere. The future of the Amazon, and perhaps of human civilization itself, depends on our ability to learn from the achievements and failures of the ancient cities that once flourished beneath the forest canopy. Their story continues in the living traditions of indigenous communities who maintain connections to knowledge systems that understood the secret of sustainable abundance. The rediscovery of these ancient knowledge systems faces obstacles that extend beyond academic resistance or institutional inertia. In the depths of the Amazon, where the most intact traditional communities persist, modern pressures accelerate faster than documentation efforts can keep pace. Illegal gold mining operations carve scars through territories that have remained unchanged for centuries. Cattle ranchers clear forest at rates that eliminate entire ecosystems before their cultural significance can be recorded. Drug trafficking networks establish bases in remote areas, making traditional territories too dangerous for researchers and community members alike. Yet beneath this chaos, something remarkable persists. In villages accessible only by days of river travel, elders continue to practice forms of agriculture that their ancestors developed over millennia. They plant crops according to lunar cycles, tracked through oral calendars more precise than written almanacs. They manage forest gardens that produce yields exceeding industrial monocultures, while maintaining biodiversity that scientists struggle to catalog. They heal ailments using plant combinations that pharmaceutical companies spend millions trying to reverse engineer. The precision of these traditional practices becomes apparent when researchers attempt to document them systematically. What initially appears as simple subsistence farming reveals itself as complex agroecology requiring intimate knowledge of soil chemistry, plant genetics, and ecosystem dynamics. Traditional farmers understand relationships between dozens of crop varieties and hundreds of associated species. They recognize subtle environmental indicators that predict weather patterns, pest outbreaks, and optimal harvest timing with accuracy that surpasses meteorological forecasting. This agricultural sophistication extends to post-harvest processing techniques that transform raw materials into foods with enhanced nutritional value and extended storage life. Traditional fermentation methods create products that modern food science recognizes as probiotics and functional foods. Smoking and drying techniques preserve proteins and carbohydrates without chemical additives, while enhancing flavors that contemporary cuisine cannot replicate. The knowledge required for these techniques was accumulated through generations of careful experimentation and systematic observation. Traditional food systems represent research programs that span centuries, testing countless combinations of ingredients, processing methods, and storage techniques. The survivors of this extended experimentation process are technologies optimized through longer testing periods than any modern research program could sustain. But accessing this knowledge requires understanding cultural contexts that determine when, how, and with whom traditional techniques can be shared. Food preparation is not merely technical activity, but cultural practice embedded within social relationships, spiritual beliefs, and seasonal ceremonies. Learning traditional techniques requires participation in cultural systems that transmit knowledge through apprenticeship relationships extending over years or decades. The social dimensions of knowledge transmission become apparent when researchers attempt to document traditional practices through conventional ethnographic methods. Written descriptions capture superficial details but miss crucial elements that can only be learned through direct participation. The timing of specific activities, the subtle sensory cues that indicate process completion, the spiritual protocols that ensure successful outcomes. These elements require embodied learning that cannot be reduced to text or video documentation. This experiential dimension of traditional knowledge creates challenges for preservation efforts that rely on external documentation. Academic researchers can record what they observe, but they cannot capture the tacit knowledge that guides expert practitioners. The result is documentation that preserves forms without substance, creating archives that appear comprehensive but lack the cultural context necessary for practical application. The limitations of external documentation have led to new approaches that emphasize community-controlled knowledge preservation. Indigenous organizations are developing their own documentation programs that combine traditional and modern methods to create records accessible to community members while maintaining cultural authenticity. These programs typically involve elders working with younger community members to create teaching materials that preserve both technical and cultural dimensions of traditional knowledge. The success of community-controlled preservation depends on intergenerational collaboration that faces significant challenges from social changes affecting indigenous communities. Younger generations often lack fluency in traditional languages essential for understanding technical terminology. They may have limited experience with subsistence activities that provide context for traditional knowledge. Urban education systems may not recognize traditional knowledge as intellectually valuable, creating conflicts between cultural preservation and economic advancement. These challenges require innovative approaches that make traditional knowledge relevant to contemporary circumstances while maintaining cultural authenticity. Some communities are developing programs that combine traditional ecological knowledge with modern environmental science to address current conservation challenges. Others are adapting traditional agricultural techniques for commercial production that provides economic opportunities while preserving cultural practices. The adaptation of traditional knowledge to contemporary applications requires careful balance between innovation and preservation. Changes that make traditional practices more economically viable may also alter their cultural significance or ecological relationships. Commercial applications may require standardization that eliminates local variations essential for ecosystem adaptation. Market pressures may favor techniques that produce immediate returns over practices that maintain long-term sustainability. Successfully navigating these tensions requires deep understanding of the cultural values and ecological relationships that make traditional knowledge effective. External researchers and development practitioners must learn to distinguish between essential elements that must be preserved and peripheral features that can be modified without compromising system integrity. This understanding develops through extended collaboration that allows outsiders to appreciate the sophistication of traditional knowledge systems. Researchers who initially approach traditional practices with skepticism often discover levels of complexity that exceed their own professional expertise. Agricultural scientists find farming techniques that achieve better yields with fewer inputs than industrial methods. Medical researchers encounter therapeutic approaches that address conditions conventional medicine cannot treat effectively. The sophistication of traditional knowledge becomes particularly apparent when examined through the lens of systems thinking. Traditional practices typically integrate multiple functions and objectives in ways that optimize overall system performance rather than maximizing single variables. Traditional agriculture produces food while maintaining soil fertility, providing habitat for beneficial species, and supplying materials for crafts and medicine. Traditional architecture creates shelter while regulating temperature, managing water flow, and providing spaces for social activities. This integrative approach contrasts sharply with modern specialized technologies that optimize specific functions while externalizing costs and side effects. Industrial agriculture maximizes crop yields but depletes soil and eliminates biodiversity. Modern architecture controls interior climate but consumes enormous energy and creates waste disposal problems. Contemporary medicine treats specific symptoms but often ignores underlying causes and system-wide effects. The systemic perspective embedded in traditional knowledge offers models for developing more sustainable approaches to contemporary challenges. Traditional systems demonstrate that high performance and environmental sustainability are compatible when technologies are designed within appropriate cultural frameworks. Their example suggests that many current environmental problems result not from technical limitations, but from cultural values that prioritize short-term optimization over long-term system health. Applying traditional systemic principles to contemporary problems requires fundamental changes in how technologies are developed and evaluated. Instead of optimizing single performance measures, development processes must consider multiple objectives, including environmental impact, social equity, and long-term sustainability. This requires interdisciplinary collaboration that integrates technical expertise with cultural knowledge and ecological understanding. The complexity of such integration becomes apparent when researchers attempt to adapt traditional techniques for modern applications. Traditional soil management practices, for example, cannot be simply transferred to industrial agriculture without understanding the ecological relationships that make them effective. The techniques work within complex systems that include specific plant communities, soil organisms, and seasonal cycles that may not exist in modern agricultural landscapes. Successful adaptation requires reconstructing the ecological and cultural contexts that support traditional practices. This may involve reintroducing native plant species, modifying soil management techniques, and developing new social institutions that can maintain long-term system integrity. The process often takes years to complete and requires sustained collaboration between traditional knowledge holders and technical specialists. The investment required for such adaptation reflects the complexity of traditional knowledge systems and the time needed to understand their operational principles. But the outcomes justify the effort by producing technologies that are more effective and more sustainable than conventional alternatives. Traditional techniques adapted for contemporary applications consistently demonstrate superior environmental performance, while often achieving better economic results. The success of these adaptations has attracted attention from development agencies and technology companies seeking more sustainable approaches to global challenges. Traditional knowledge offers models for technologies that can address human needs while maintaining environmental health. But accessing this knowledge requires partnerships that respect indigenous intellectual property and provide equitable benefits to knowledge holders. The frameworks for such partnerships are still evolving as legal systems struggle to address questions of collective intellectual property and traditional cultural rights. Indigenous communities are increasingly assertive about maintaining control over their cultural heritage while engaging selectively in collaborations that serve their interests. This shift requires development practitioners to abandon extractive approaches in favor of genuine partnerships that empower communities to control how their knowledge is used. The transformation toward partnership-based collaboration reflects growing recognition that traditional knowledge cannot be effectively utilized without understanding the cultural context that make it meaningful. Technical information divorced from cultural context loses much of its effectiveness because it lacks the social mechanisms that ensure appropriate application and long-term maintenance. This recognition has led to new models of research and development that integrate technical and cultural dimensions from the beginning of collaborative relationships. These models typically involve extended periods of relationship building during which external partners demonstrate respect for cultural protocols and commitment to community goals. Research activities are designed collaboratively to address priorities identified by communities rather than imposed by external institutions. Of such partnerships often exceed expectations. The outcomes, because they mobilize cultural resources that purely technical approaches cannot access. Community members bring not just information, but motivation, social networks, and cultural frameworks that enable effective implementation of development initiatives. Their participation ensures that projects remain relevant to local conditions and continue functioning after external support ends. The sustainability of partnership-based approaches reflects their foundation in cultural values that prioritize long-term relationships over short-term transactions. Traditional knowledge holders understand collaboration as ongoing reciprocal relationship rather than simple information exchange. They expect partners to provide continuing support and to share benefits equitably over extended time periods. Meeting these expectations requires fundamental changes in institutional cultures that have traditionally operated according to project cycles measured in months or years. Traditional collaboration operates according to generational timescales that require institutional commitments extending far beyond typical funding cycles. This temporal mismatch creates challenges for external organizations seeking to engage authentically with indigenous communities. Resolving these temporal conflicts requires innovative institutional arrangements that can maintain long-term commitments while adapting to changing circumstances. Some organizations are developing endowment funds that can support ongoing collaboration regardless of short-term funding fluctuations. Others are creating permanent positions for community liaisons who can maintain relationships across multiple project cycles. The institutional innovations reflect growing understanding that effective collaboration with indigenous communities requires different organizational structures and operational procedures than conventional research and development activities. Traditional knowledge cannot be accessed through standard academic or commercial relationships, but requires cultural protocols that prioritize relationship building over information extraction. The cultural dimensions of collaboration become particularly important when addressing sensitive knowledge domains that have spiritual or ceremonial significance. Traditional healing practices, for example, often involve ritual elements that cannot be separated from therapeutic techniques without compromising their effectiveness. Sacred sites may contain important ecological information that cannot be shared without violating cultural taboos. Respecting these cultural boundaries while still enabling beneficial collaboration requires sophisticated understanding of indigenous worldviews and value systems. External partners must learn to distinguish between knowledge domains that can be shared openly and those that require special protocols or restricted access. This learning process often takes years and requires genuine commitment to understanding cultural perspectives that may differ fundamentally from Western scientific traditions. The depth of cultural learning required for authentic collaboration explains why successful partnerships typically involve long-term relationships between specific individuals rather than formal agreements between institutions. Personal relationships enable the trust and mutual understanding necessary for navigating cultural complexities that formal protocols cannot anticipate. These interpersonal relationships also provide mechanisms for resolving conflicts and misunderstandings that inevitably arise when different cultural systems interact. Traditional conflict resolution processes can address disputes in ways that preserve relationships while achieving practical solutions. External partners who understand these processes can participate constructively rather than imposing their own cultural approaches to problem solving. The effectiveness of culturally informed collaboration becomes apparent when comparing outcomes from partnership-based projects with those from conventional development initiatives. Projects that operate according to indigenous cultural protocols consistently achieve better results in terms of community satisfaction, environmental outcomes, and long-term sustainability. These superior results reflect the mobilization of cultural resources that conventional approaches cannot access. Traditional knowledge systems include not just technical information, but social mechanisms that ensure appropriate implementation and long-term maintenance. Cultural values that prioritize collective welfare over individual gain create social foundations for sustainable resource management. The integration of cultural and technical dimensions in traditional knowledge systems offers models for addressing contemporary challenges that require both technological innovation and social transformation. Climate change, for example, cannot be addressed through technical solutions alone, but requires changes in human behavior and social organization that cultural approaches can facilitate. Traditional knowledge systems demonstrate that technological and cultural innovation can proceed simultaneously when development occurs within appropriate cultural frameworks. Their example suggests that many current problems result not from technical limitations, but from cultural values that prevent implementation of available solutions. The relevance of traditional cultural frameworks extends beyond environmental challenges to encompass broader questions of social organization and human development. Traditional societies often achieve levels of social equity and community cohesion that contemporary societies struggle to maintain despite much greater material wealth. The social technologies developed by traditional societies include institutions for collective decision-making, conflict resolution, and resource distribution that enabled stable governance without centralized authority. These institutions operated according to principles of consensus building and reciprocal obligation that maintained social harmony while preserving individual autonomy. Modern political systems could benefit from understanding these traditional governance mechanisms, particularly as contemporary societies struggle with polarization and institutional dysfunction. Traditional approaches to collective decision-making often achieve better outcomes than majority-rule democracy because they require consensus building that addresses minority concerns. The consensus-building processes used in traditional societies typically involve extended discussion periods that allow all perspectives to be heard and considered. Decisions emerge through gradual convergence of opinion rather than competitive voting that creates winners and losers. The resulting agreements typically have stronger community support because they address concerns raised by all participants. These traditional governance processes require cultural frameworks that prioritize collective welfare over individual advantage. Participants must be willing to modify their positions in response to others' concerns and to accept outcomes that may not fully satisfy their preferences. The cultural values that support such behavior are transmitted through educational processes that emphasize reciprocity and mutual responsibility. The educational dimensions of traditional knowledge transmission offer models for developing more effective approaches to contemporary learning challenges. Traditional education typically involves experiential learning within cultural contexts that make knowledge meaningful and memorable. Students learn by participating in activities that demonstrate the practical relevance of information while reinforcing cultural values. This approach contrasts with formal education systems that often separate learning from application and present information without cultural context. Traditional learning processes achieve better retention and more effective skill development because they integrate cognitive, emotional, and social dimensions of human development. As we stand at the edge of the forest today, satellite images revealing geometric shadows beneath the canopy, we are witnessing more than archaeological discovery. We are recovering humanity's forgotten conversation with the earth itself. The lost cities of the Amazon were never truly lost, only silenced by catastrophe and time. They live on in the enriched soils that still nurture towering trees, in the geometric precision of ancient earthworks, and most profoundly, in the knowledge carried by indigenous communities who remember what we are only beginning to rediscover. Their ancestors built not monuments to kings, but monuments to balance. They created not empires of conquest, but empires of reciprocity. In their silence lies a whisper that grows louder with each new revelation. That another way is possible, has always been possible, and waits beneath the canopy for us to learn its language once again.